Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first in our webinar series presented by ENSafrica. I'm just going to ask my colleague Darlet to share, there we go, our presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who's joined us. I know we were running a little bit late, so apologies for that. And I see that people are still joining as we go. As I said, this is the first in quite a long webinar series that ENSafrica will be running over the next 3 months up until the end of May. And we're very excited to kick off with this exciting presentation today. Perhaps just to set the scene and give a bit of background to what we're doing and why we're running this webinar series, this is part of our efforts to give back to the community in which we work, not only to assist our very valued clients with continuous professional development hours, for those of them in the financial services sector who need it, but also to ensure that other participants in the industry, whether clients or not, are able to engage in the views and the ideas of our subject matter experts. And it's an opportunity for us to share our thinking on ESG and to unpack some very important topics. Within ENSafrica, we have an ESG practice group, which is a multidisciplinary group made up of colleagues from all of the different affected departments. So we have colleagues from our tax department, from our restructuring department, from our natural resources and environment department, myself from the banking and finance department, as well as some other colleagues from the banking and finance department. All of us, as well as the corporate commercial department, I mustn't forget them. So all of us working together bring various different disciplines to the mix, make up the ESG practice group. And through that group, we hope to support our clients. We are supporting our clients in integrating ESG into their businesses and acclimatizing themselves to the risks of climate change. So the purpose of the webinar series, as I've said, is to further discussion of the very important topics, or of several very important topics, which we've highlighted under the ESG umbrella. You will have seen from the invite that we've broken these topics down to the E, the S, and the G, as we believe in prioritizing all three aspects of ESG, both within our own business and within our practice areas. We, as an ESG practice group, have been, as I've said, partnering with our clients along their own critical journey towards ESG integration. And we ourselves have also been grappling with what this means for us as a business and how we can do our part to ensure that this conversation moves forward, that we educate each other and the decision maker, and that we are sure to be able to do all we can to move the needle on this important topic. So just one housekeeping reminder before I introduce our speakers for today, and that is that, as I've said, this is a webinar series. This is the first of 15 webinars being offered by ENSafrica. If you would like to register for any of the other webinars, you can do so by emailing marketing@ensafrica.com, and that information is on the bottom of your screen. So without wasting any more time, as I'm sure there'll be many questions today, and I know our speakers have got a very exciting lineup, I'm going to hand over to them now. We will start with Darlet Anstey, who is from our Natural Resources and Environment Department, and she will kick off the presentation. She will then hand over to Colin Fratelli Davies, who will share her thoughts with you on the climate change bill. And finally, James Brand, also from the Natural Resources and Environment Department, will round off the presentation talking about some model clauses that can be used to think about climate change in contractual arrangements. You can ask questions at any time by putting your questions in the Q&A block at the bottom. Please post them there. I will be monitoring the Q&A and I will pose your questions to the presenters at the end of the presentation. So please do put your questions in the Q&A block. Thanks very much, and Darlet, I hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Jess, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So I'm not going to be repetitive because Jess gave everyone a very nice overview of the presentation for today. So I think I'm just going to get straight into it. Let's just go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to be introducing the topic of climate change. I'm also going to be articulating some of the climate risks, especially with focus on the financial services sector. And I will also be talking about the existing legal framework that actually regulates climate change in South Africa. My colleagues, Colin will be talking about some of the things in the pipeline with respect to the climate change bill. So I will not be talking about that. Okay, so to begin with climate change, I thought maybe it would be a good idea just to start with some terminology. So when we're talking about climate change, we're referring to the long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns. These shifts may be natural, but since the 1980s, human activities have been the main driver of climate change, primarily due to the burning of fossil fuels, which produces heat-trapping gases, and that's from the UN. Then I also thought maybe it's important to distinguish the terms carbon neutral and net zero, because I'm sure you guys have heard quite a lot about these things. And so I thought, let me just start by actually distinguishing between the two concepts. So carbon neutral means balancing greenhouse gas emissions by offsetting or removing from the atmosphere an equivalent amount of carbon for the amount produced. So this can be achieved through carbon credits, and we'll see that South Africa has actually introduced a carbon credit system in line with the Carbon Tax Act. But it's in essence permission to emit carbon dioxide or other GHG in exchange for offsetting the effects of those emissions. A commitment to carbon neutrality does not require a commitment to reduce overall GHG emissions. The carbon neutral business only needs to offset the greenhouse gas emissions it produces, even if those emissions are increasing. Then we have the concept of net zero, which is a commitment to net zero, means reducing greenhouse gas emissions with the goal of balancing the emissions produced and emissions removed from the Earth's atmosphere. So you can see that, the two are slightly nuanced, and the one is kind of more intense than the other as regards climate commitments. So I thought a good place to start would be to discuss climate risks. And the obvious place to start with articulating climate risks is the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report. So the 2022 report, it focuses a lot on the societal and environmental concerns. And we will see that environmental risks are perceived to be amongst 5 of the most critical long-term threats to the world as the most potentially damaging to people on the planet. So the following are actually ranked as a part of the top 3 most severe risks: climate action failure, extreme weather, and biodiversity loss. And I think it's important to distinguish between those 3 things, because often they're conflated in discussions. But so let's try and keep those concepts also distinct. So the issue that the Global Risk Report suggests is that a disorderly climate transition will exacerbate inequalities. And the thing is that COVID-19 and climate change COVID-19 has had kind of interesting implications for climate change. So during the lockdowns, we saw a global dip in greenhouse gas emissions, but then the upward trajectories just resumed, and greenhouse gas emission rates rose faster in 2020 than the average over the last decade. So I think a lot of people point to the lockdowns as kind of like a good period for greenhouse gas emissions, but actually we can see the stats suggest something otherwise. The other thing that COVID-19 did is that the widening gap between rich and poor nations has worsened as a result of COVID-19. Now we know that climate change will have disproportionate effects on different parts of the world, and we know that the developing world will experience especially in South Africa, we know that we will experience severe vulnerabilities as a result of climate change. So the fact that COVID-19 has created further divisions within the world is quite worrying. And then I suppose the other thing that COVID-19 resulted in were these short-term domestic pressures, which will make it harder for governments to focus on longer-term priorities, and will limit the global political capital allocated to such concerns. But the issue is that climate change is often seen as a long-term issue, but we know that actually the consequences of climate change and the impacts are already manifesting. So in 2020, we had multiple cities around the world experiencing some of the most extreme temperatures ever seen, and hitting record highs. And to bring it closer to home, I mean, Cape Town and the Western Cape almost experienced day zero in the droughts a couple of years ago. But in January 2022, the Western Cape experienced record high temperatures. So this and high temperatures causes greater chances of fires and will increase in water usage. So we're already starting to see the risks, the climate change risks starting to manifest. So we have to stop looking at it as a long-term problem. All right. So given the complexities of technological, economic, and societal changes on the scale, and the insufficient nature of our current commitments, it is likely that any transition that achieves the net zero goal by 2050 will be disorderly. Countries continuing down the path of reliance on carbon-intensive sectors risk losing competitive advantage through a higher cost of carbon, reduced resilience, failure to keep up with the technological innovation, and limited leverage in trade agreements. Yet shifting away from carbon-intense industries, which currently employ millions of workers, will have negative effects and increase geopolitical tensions. Adopting hasty environmental policies will also have unintended consequences for nature. A transition that fails to account for societal implications will exacerbate the inequalities within and between countries, heightening geopolitical frictions. So just to hone in on the risks for financial institutions that could result from climate change. So we have sorry. I've lost my notes. Okay, there we go. Let me just go here. Sorry. So just on the risks, so for financial institutions on climate change. So the impacts of climate change on the global and South African financial sector are potentially significant if not mitigated and adaptation measures are not implemented. Climate risks for financial institutions can be classified as physical risks from extreme weather, directly affecting financial institutions' own operations or assets that they finance through damage, business disruption, or default risks. Then there are transition risks resulting from disruptive technologies, changing regulation, consumer market preferences. And then there's liability and disclosure risks resulting from loss and damages, rising insurance costs, directors' liability, and disclosure failures. Financial institutions potentially are exposed through a lack of adaptation of their underlying assets or investments or portfolios to climate change risks. So just to touch on some of the regulatory risks that we have as a result or that we will start to see with climate change. So there's a shift from voluntary measures to hard law. When we look at the global trends, we see that shifts in the EU, especially with regards to ESG and sustainable finance, and the domestication of international obligations with respect to the Paris Agreement are resulting in tangible law. So we have now in the EU, the sustainable finance disclosure regulations, the taxonomy regulations, and a carbon border tax, which will have huge implications for countries that trade with the EU, such as, especially in Africa. But another thing just to mention that often gets forgotten. So the stock exchanges also play a massive role in climate change measures. And so just yesterday, a proposal was passed by the SEC that will require publicly traded companies to disclose climate-related information to investors, and that's in the US. In South Africa, we have the JSE Sustainability and Climate Change Disclosure Guidance Notes, which, although are voluntary, we are of the view that that will revolutionize how clients and financial institutions report on climate disclosures, but also mostly how investee companies will be expected to report by investors. So, the guidance note aims to provide specific guidance to financial services, to the financial services sector. And the JSE notes that climate change disclosure is a journey. And it tries to assist companies in commencing with their journeys. In light of the risks articulated above, all companies would do well to seriously consider these excellent documents and integrate them into their practices and reporting as soon as possible to ensure that there's not a lag behind in terms of international best practice. The JSE recommends a 3-stage approach to climate disclosures. The first being disclosure, diagnosis, and context. The second is integration of climate-related risks and opportunities. And then there's disclosure of climate-related practices and data. So moving along swiftly. So as I said, I would just give also a brief overview of the current measures that are in place in South Africa in terms of regulation that regulate climate change. So unfortunately, I will say that South Africa has a piecemeal approach towards climate change regulation. The Climate Change Act, which my colleague Colin will discuss in a minute, will go a long way to putting the country on a much more coordinated course when it comes to issues of climate change. The current regulatory framework looks as follows. So the Department of Environmental Affairs is responsible for the coordination and implementation of South Africa's climate change commitments. And then the most important legislation that we have at the moment is NEMAQA, which is the National Environmental Management Air Quality Act, which controls air emissions and air quality. But I will point out that there's a slight nuance between climate change and air quality. The two topics are obviously very much linked. But, air quality also focuses on health. So you have the ambient air quality standards, which are focused on health. But there is obviously a natural overlap between climate change and air quality regulation. And so there's been a number of regulations that have been introduced under NEMAQA to address reporting of greenhouse gas emissions and introducing pollution prevention plans for certain emitters. So these regulations have actually been in place for a while. For instance, the National Greenhouse Gas Emission Reporting Regulations, which will give the Department of Environmental Affairs a lot of intel as to what they need to regulate and how. Then there's the National Pollution Prevention Plan regulations, technical guidelines for the validation and verification of greenhouse gas emissions, and then some others. And then I'd say that the other really important regulatory measure that's been taken to date is the carbon tax regime. So the Carbon Tax Act of 2019, it introduces, it's intended to contribute to the global effort to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions so as to avoid dangerous anthropogenic climate change, while also ensuring that socioeconomic development proceeds in a sustainable manner. It gives recognition and implements the polluter pays principle, which is a fundamental principle in environmental law that acknowledges that costs of remedying pollution, environmental degradation, and consequent adverse health effects must be paid for by those responsible. So, just to kind of, the people who are required to pay carbon tax are listed in Schedule 2. And these are the activities are listed in Schedule 2, and these are the activities which result in greenhouse gas emissions that exceed thresholds listed in Schedule 2. There's a phased approach that will be taken here. It's going to be implemented in 3 phases, the Carbon Tax Act. And the second phase is it was originally meant to start in 2023, but the first phase has now been pushed out slightly. There's in this kind of first phase, there's sizable tax-free allowances for carbon emitters. And then there's also notable exclusions. So the agriculture, forestry, and other land use and waste sectors are exempt, and Eskom's also exempt in terms of this first phase. So I think I don't want to go into too much detail on the Carbon Tax Act because I stand to be corrected, yes, but I think that there's actually a dedicated presentation on the Carbon Tax Act. But I do just want to mention as well that, so there's obvious financial risks that are associated with a carbon tax and its implementation. And there's also opportunities associated with carbon offsets. So there's the carbon offset regulations that have been introduced. And an offset is defined as an avoidance or a reduction or a sequestration of a carbon dioxide equivalent emissions recognized in terms of an approved project. So offsets can be used by firms to reduce their carbon tax liability up to a limit. And yeah, I think so. Carbon offsets are also known as carbon credits, and they can be sold to carbon taxpayers to reduce their carbon tax liability. The Department of Environmental Affairs will be kind of also spearheading this alongside with National Treasury. And there's a number of different opportunities there, but also, you know, some kind of technical issues around ownership, who owns carbon credits. And I'm sure that, you know, financial institutions would kind of want to know where that ownership lies. It's a relatively contested question, but yeah, I don't want to go into too much detail on that. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Colin, who will be presenting on the core features of the climate change bill as well as its architecture. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us again, and I am going to now deal with the climate change bill, which will deal with bringing together, as Dalit has mentioned, the various aspects of climate change to date. And it's really important, as you mentioned, that the various role players, particularly government, addresses climate change from a holistic view. And this bill at least seeks to draw everything together. Our erstwhile colleagues, Andrew Gilder and Olivia Rumble, they actually drafted this bill. They're now climate legal. And I'm just going to go through the various aspects of the bill. It was introduced to Parliament earlier this year, and it really seeks to deal with the nitty-gritty and almost bridging the gap between the science and the law to ensure that various aspects, particularly dealing with mitigation and adaptation, is dealt with. And I'll go into the actual definitions, but very briefly, just as Dalit mentioned, all of the impacts from climate change will have to be addressed in a manner. So we'll have to adapt to the extreme weather and the various impacts that will be associated with climate change. And so there are various studies and strategies that have to be implemented in order to ensure that we can adapt and then mitigate those effects from climate change. Okay, so we're going to look briefly at the architecture of the bill, which deals with some strategies and plans that government is required to put in place. And then, as I mentioned, adaptation and mitigation, as well as carbon budgets, which links to the carbon offsets, and then penalties, which are imposed, which link to forms of imprisonment, as well as fines, and more notably, increased taxes. Okay, so as I mentioned, there is a legal obligation, particularly on the government, all organs of state, to ensure that the various legislation and the impacts that we have to date is all pulled together and ensured that it's put into various policies and plans and all decision making, so that we have a holistic approach towards climate change. And one of the other aspects of the climate change bill is that the president can establish a body called the Presidential Climate Commission. This has in fact been established already back in December 2020. And the main purpose of the PCC is to advise the president on climate change impacts and adaptation that can be incorporated to ensure that we obviously deal with it as best we can. So the climate change bill then also gives a further mandate and just confirms that mandate to assist the president. And at the moment, it is filled with about 22 members. The president is the main chairperson of the PCC, and then Mr. Vali Musa is currently the deputy chairman or chairperson of the PCC. Then next, we also look at how, again, as I'll mention it a few times, that we need to look at climate change from a holistic perspective. So the bill deals with the requirements on local authorities from a lower government level perspective, and then all the way up to a national level. So from a local level, the mayors and the MECs will be responsible for determining the impacts and the needs, as well as the response to the needs, and provide an assessment within their local jurisdiction, just to see how climate change impacts will affect them. And they're required to do that assessment within 2 years. Within 2 years after doing the assessment, they have to develop a climate change response implementation plan. So that will then determine, again, as I mentioned earlier, it will ensure that various aspects of the effects in that local community are taken into account for policy, programs, plans, and law within that area. Then there's also the allowance for review and amendment of these implementation plans every 5 years. And then, as I already mentioned, and we're going to focus on, the aspects of adaptation and mitigation are very important in the bill, because it's our response essentially to climate change. So when we're dealing with adaptation, it's just, as we all understand, adapt, it's to change to current circumstances. And in particular, the bill defines the term as any adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli or their effects, which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. And then in particular, adaptation is dealt with in Chapter 4, and Section 16 particularly refers to and allows for the determination of adaptation objectives. So when we're looking at Section 16 in particular, the Minister, which in this case, again, as Dalit mentioned, is the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, she will have to determine the various national adaptation objectives in order to ensure that the country addresses climate change. And in Section 16, it also then provides for the fact that there must be indicators for measuring our progress towards achieving those national adaptation objectives, so how we're going to meet those. And then there should also be a date, obviously, in order to determine how we are faring against those objectives. And that has to be dealt with from a national planning perspective, and again, just bringing everything together from policies to programs to law to ensure that we are addressing those impacts. Okay, and then another manner, as I mentioned in the beginning, the majority of the work or the requirements in the bill relate to a lot of assessments, planning and studies in order to determine what our mitigation and how we're going to adapt to the climate change. And one of those instruments, so we dealt with the assessments that the local authorities will have to deal with. And then from a national perspective, there is the NASP, or the National Adaptation Strategy Plan. We've obviously seen strategies in many different areas, from energy to waste to water, and these are usually guiding documents in order to address the manner in which we're going to deal with various aspects of the impacts that we have. And so this particular plan, the NASP, must be dealt with, and assessments must be conducted 2 years after the bill has come into effect. And once those assessments have been done and the bill and the plan has been established, again, there is a mechanism to review and amend the NASP every 5 years. And then just to give some detail into what that NASP will deal with, I think a lot of these bullet points all point to the same thing. And it's essentially just to determine what impacts climate change will have on particular societies and areas within our country, so that will be the science behind the actual plan. So determining what those impacts will be, and then to ensure that we can actually adapt and change and mitigate those impacts, then the plan will have to look to reduction of the risk and the vulnerabilities that relate to climate change, and ensure that the national adaptation objectives, which will still be determined, will also be achieved through the NASP. Then again, this is an added layer. So we have our local, then our national plan, and then we also have a sector adaptation strategy and plan. And this logically will deal with particular industry, which will have impacts on the environment based on climate change. So based on your greenhouse gas emissions and that. And the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy, as well as the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, will conduct a further assessment. So the national assessment will obviously pinpoint areas of vulnerability, and then the sector adaptation strategy will hone in even more on the particular industries and sectors that are most vulnerable. And this strategy and plan must be done and conducted a year after the publication of the NASP. So again, it just comes back to the principle that everything has to speak to the various aspects that the bill outlines, so that there isn't overlap or contradiction. And then once the assessment has been done, as I mentioned, this will go into even more detail, especially from a scientific perspective, dealing with risks and vulnerabilities. And then once those assessments have been done, which will be a year after the national strategy, after the NASP, then a further 2 years later, the SASP must be established. And then again, there is provision for review and amendment of this strategy every 5 years. Okay, then some other aspects of the bill, including mitigation, which is obviously important to deal with the adaptation that is required. The carbon budget links to carbon offsets. So here it will be determined on a person or a juristic person basis what carbon budgets there are. And so there, if we just look, the carbon budget is specifically defined as an assigned amount of greenhouse gas emissions allocated to a person in terms of Section 25 for direct emissions arising from the operations of that person over a defined time period. And so the carbon budgets will be regulated, and then, as you'll see later, there are implications if the budgets are not complied with. And just to give a technical definition of mitigation for purposes of the bill, I have it there as the human intervention to reduce the sources or enhance the carbon sinks of greenhouse gases. Great, and so carbon budgets, as I mentioned, will link to the carbon offsets. And as I also mentioned as well, so it will deal with particular activities that emit greenhouse gases. So it will link to carbon tax. And again, this is where the bill seeks to pull everything together. And in particular, when allocating carbon budgets, the minister must take various factors into account, including socioeconomic impacts, best practical environmental options available, and the national strategic priorities. So that would obviously deal with specific sectors and their priorities. Okay, and then once the person is allocated a particular carbon budget, if they must prepare a mitigation plan. So the greenhouse gas mitigation plan must describe how they are going to mitigate their impacts to ensure that their carbon budget is achieved. And so that's also an important plan. So this goes down to the person. So we have our local, national, sectoral, and then finally our mitigation plan that is particular to a juristic person. And then particular obligations that will be imposed through the carbon budgets relate to the fact that they'll obviously have to, once it's been produced, the mitigation plan must be approved and complied with, and the progress on that carbon budget must be closely monitored, and there will be annual reporting and progress. Then, as I already alluded to, when we look at the offences and penalties, it is an offence to fail to prepare and submit a greenhouse gas mitigation plan, and the specific penalties are linked to NEMA, and there it would be a 5 million rand fine or imprisonment for 5 years. And if there's a second offence, then it will be 10 million rand or imprisonment for 10 years. And relating to the actual carbon budgets, to the extent that they are not complied with, it is an offence. And as I already mentioned, then that wrongdoer will be held to a higher carbon tax rate. So it's all linked again back to the carbon offsets and taxes that are already in place. And with that, that is the end of the bill. So thank you for sitting through the more legalistic section of our presentation. And now I'm going to hand over to James, who can deal with the more practical clauses that will be important for all of you.
Thanks very much, Colin. Sorry, I'm just busy getting set up here. Hopefully you can all hear me, and shortly you should be able to see the slides. So if you can just give me a thumbs up, Dalit, perhaps that you can see that. Okay, good stuff. So thanks very much, Colin and Dalit. So for this part of the session, I look to take the very real concerns identified by Dalit around climate change and how this is anticipated to be addressed by the climate change bill, as mentioned by Colin, and identify some contractual provisions that we can start to consider to reduce risk and to anticipate what is to come. While such clauses may be considered off-market now, it's unlikely to be long before embedding climate awareness into our drafting will become mainstream. I'll identify some climate clauses that are likely to be of interest, but don't worry if you do not get to read all the clauses that are in the slides to follow, as I understand these presentations will be circulated afterwards. The intention really is just to get you thinking, to hopefully kick off climate awareness when it comes to working with your precedent agreements. I want to do this by introducing you to the Chancery Lane Project, or the TCLP as it's known, which is an open source climate change clause precedent bank, with each clause being subjected to meticulous peer review, quality control processes before being published on the website of the TCLP. It's a collaborative effort of legal professionals from around the world, whose aim is to support parties in the transaction sector with contracts that reduce risk and enable solutions to climate change. As of January this year, the TCLP community included over 1,300 legal professionals from around the world and over 285 participating organizations, including all the top 25 UK law firms and many of the top 25 US law firms as well. The TCLP was launched in London, UK in 2019, and has since expanded to multiple jurisdictions around the world. To date, there are over 100 climate clauses published on their website that have been viewed and downloaded in over 114 countries around the world. Late last year, myself and other colleagues in our ESG working group attended workshops hosted by the TCLP, and we're busy looking at ways to implement and update our standard precedents to take into account the most relevant of these clauses. Climate clauses are not static and need to be adapted to take into account country and client-specific considerations. Equally, climate change itself is a dynamic process and is also subject to change. And as time evolves, these clauses need to be updated and panel beat to domestic as well as evolving climate change considerations. But they provide a very useful baseline or starting point for climate conscious drafting. And in this 15-minute slot, I'll look to unpack some clauses as an introduction to what's out there and hopefully get you thinking about climate conscious drafting in your transactions. This slide helps to contextualize the different clauses and where they fit in across the contractual lifecycle of an entity or operation. The financing and investment related clauses will be most relevant to most of you, but just be aware that there are model climate clauses that can be considered throughout the lifecycle of a project or company. Key to working with any of these TCLP clauses is to understand two key concepts. The one was addressed by Dalit, and that is net zero and what that means. And the second is to understand how your scoping, scope 1, 2, and 3 are considered and what they mean. I'll touch on both of these concepts briefly in the slides to follow. And although Dalit did touch on net zero, I think it's worth me just elaborating on that just because they're so key and critical to the TCLP clauses. Now, parties to the Paris Agreement, making up 196 countries responsible for more than 90% of global emissions, committed to holding the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, recognizing that this would significantly reduce the risk and impacts of climate change. In order to achieve this, science-based targets suggest that we need to reach net zero by 2050. There's consensus that to do this, we need to set interim targets and act immediately. However, in order to meet net zero, the whole global economy must rapidly transition. But what does net zero mean? The concept of net zero can be explained with reference to a concept we're more familiar with, and that is the concept of carbon neutrality. There are 4 key differences, which I'll go through briefly, which I think will give you a better understanding of what the net zero concept is all about. Firstly, carbon neutral focuses only on carbon and not all of the greenhouse gases, and refers to a policy of not increasing existing carbon emissions, so maintaining the status quo in effect by achieving a lack of net carbon increases through offsets, using carbon credits from renewable facilities, for example. Whereas net zero as a concept aims to eliminate the emission of greenhouse gases, coupled with the actual removals of any residual emissions through carbon sinks and reforestation programs, for example. GHGs, or greenhouse gases, include carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, and these gases are included within the concept of net zero. Net zero is distinct from and a far more ambitious concept than carbon neutrality. Secondly, carbon neutrality for an organization only requires scope 1 and 2 emissions to be included, with scope 3 emissions being non-mandatory for consideration. Whereas when you're dealing with net zero, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions are relevant to the inquiry, and I'll unpack in a moment what those scopes mean. Thirdly, the level of emission reductions of a plan for carbon neutrality is not specified, whereas net zero targets must aim for emission reductions to align to a 1.5 degree science-based target in line with the Paris Agreement. And then fourthly and finally, carbon neutrality allows offsetting, as Dalit mentioned, for emissions without limit, whereas net zero only permits residual emissions should be offset, and they're expected to be neutralized through your reforestation or other carbon sink-related programs. With the UN Climate Change Conference, or COP26, that took place in 2021, and with momentum already starting to build for COP27 in Egypt later this year, the race to net zero is gaining momentum as a concept, and companies are signing up and making net zero pledges. In 2019, net zero pledges covered just 16% of the global economy. By 2021, nearly 70% of the global economy had committed to net zero by 2050. However, the concept of net zero has the potential to be the biggest greenwash yet, depending on how net zero is actually implemented by states and corporations. And there's a role to be played in contractual precedents to allow for the avoidance of these greenwash concerns. As we progress and mature in this journey, it can be anticipated that net zero as a concept will migrate from soft law obligation into the realm of hard law obligation. As I mentioned, understanding the scoping approach to emissions is important when dealing with the concept of net zero and the TCP clauses in particular. Measuring the footprint of an organization, product, or process involves deciding which GHG emissions will be included. This is often done using the Greenhouse Gas Protocol scoped approach. Scope 1 relates to direct company-owned or controlled emissions occurring at source. Scope 2 relates to emissions associated with the production of energy consumed by a company. And Scope 3 relates to indirect emissions associated with the company activities from sources not owned or controlled by a company. In other words, emissions down or up a supply chain, for example. There's consensus that net zero targets should aim to cover all gases and all activities and scopes. But Scope 3 emissions are often neglected by companies aiming to tackle climate change for a variety of reasons, but principally because they are the most complicated and most difficult to measure. But most companies' impacts on the environment come from supply chains, and typically the carbon emissions from a company's supply chain are by far the majority of the total emissions triggered by whatever it is a company does. But most supply chain managers don't have visibility into sustainability practices in the supply chain. The TCLP provides some useful precedents with regard to supply chain cascade clauses, such as the one in this slide as an example. Many businesses and organizations have publicly committed to a net zero target across their value chain. Their supply chain and business partners contribute to their emissions at Scope 3 level, and thus determine whether they achieve their net zero target or a carbon budget in due course as identified by Colin prior to this presentation. Clauses that back-to-back or align a business net zero target with its supply chain and business partners enable the business to achieve its net zero target. From a domestic point of view, these types of clauses can be built on and adapted to take into account other considerations that are relevant, such as our carbon tax regime, to ensure that participants down the supply chain are doing everything they can to make use of available rebates and offsets to reduce their carbon taxes, to avoid these being passed up the value chain as a cost. It's quite a long clause, and don't worry if you don't get to read all of it. As I mentioned, these slides will be circulated to you. The gist really is just to introduce you to the concept that this bank of clauses is out there and is available and ready for adaptation to your specific needs. The second clause I'd like to touch on for consideration going forward in a carbon budget type world is a carbon budget adjustment clause. Finance mechanisms in M&A activity do not typically take scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions of the target into account. This introduces uncertainty for the buyer and could prevent the buyer from managing their net zero status, and could in time impact their carbon budgets, depending on how those carbon budgets are calculated. A buyer who is net zero themselves may not want to acquire a business with an uncertain carbon footprint that will affect their overall net zero position or carbon budget. Share purchase agreements often provide for a post-completion price adjustment after the transaction has taken place based on the target company's net asset position at completion. Carbon footprints are not measured at completion, despite there being a potential cost of that carbon. One solution for this is to consider a net zero carbon budget adjustment clause that can be included and modified as part of a completion accounts mechanism in a share purchase agreement to provide carbon certainty. The next clause I'd like to consider relates to climate-related reporting. Many of you have heard of the task force on climate-related financial disclosures that is gaining traction in multiple markets when it comes to assessing and reporting on climate-related risks. There's been increased regulation globally on reporting climate-related risks, with a focus on large or listed companies, as well as asset managers and institutional investors. Many businesses do not fully consider or disclose the impacts of climate change on their business or the steps taken by them to mitigate climate change and environmental impacts of their operations. As a result, they potentially miss key risks and changes to the environment they operate in and fail to take account of opportunities to reduce emissions within their business. Additionally, financial market participant firms often rely on disclosures from a wide range of corporates that they invest in, lend to, or insure in order to comply with and report on their own climate impacts. Without reporting from these underlying corporates, these firms risk not fully complying with any reporting obligations they may have in the future. This clause is an example of a generic reporting disclosure clause that can be included in the LMA information and undertakings provisions of any corporate loan. It's not limited to loans which are either linked to sustainability goals or are considered green projects. These types of clauses can be adapted to local markets, for example, to take into account our recently published draft JSE sustainability disclosure guidelines that Dalit mentioned, and could encourage borrowers to consider their climate-related risks, mitigation opportunities, and impacts. The clause, if implemented, also allows lenders to better understand their own climate exposure, thereby improving their chances of complying with any reporting obligations they may have going forward. Finally, I'd like to touch on ESG-linked remuneration-related clauses. There's a growing expectation, particularly among institutional shareholders and their representative bodies, that listed companies will include some ESG-based performance measures as a condition to vesting of share-based incentive awards. These performance measures might relate to environmental, social, or other goals. As ESG migrates from soft law to hard law realm, organizations are going to be required to adopt a sustainable corporate culture and to incorporate and integrate ESG considerations into their wider business practice. By incorporating ESG-based performance measures, businesses will be better prepared for any such future regulation. Historically, performance conditions comprised financial targets and did not include ESG or climate targets. Using only financial targets encourages short-term behaviors and goals and is unlikely to incentivize long-term behavioral changes like reducing greenhouse gas emissions, for example, due to the lack of immediate financial returns. However, as I mentioned, there's a growing recognition of the impact that material ESG risks can have on a company's value. An increasing number of companies are incorporating a second component of their remuneration policies to include ESG-related considerations. Companies are interpreting rather integrating the management of material ESG risks and opportunities into their long-term strategy. And this can be enhanced by providing a weighted percentage of the award for traditional financial performance criteria, as well as providing a weighted percentage of the award for ESG-related performance criteria. However, the relevant ESG targets need to be clearly specified, and they need to be achievable and measurable to be effective in both meeting the targets that are set as well as incentivizing the award holder. This slide provides examples of identified possible incentive measures that would be relevant for the E part of the ESG inquiry and could relate to such things as setting a carbon footprint measuring policy within your organization, for example. This slide provides examples of identified incentive measures that would be relevant for the S part of the ESG part of the inquiry and could relate to adopting measures in respect of diversity, inclusivity, and transformation. And then finally, this slide provides examples of identified incentive measures that would be relevant for the G of the ESG part of the inquiry and could relate to adopting measures in respect of sustainability reporting or adopting codes such as CRISA, for example. In conclusion, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, set out 17 goals for benchmarking and achievement by 2030, as depicted here. Scientists have identified planetary boundaries which may not be exceeded if we are to have a stable biosphere. These planetary boundaries make up the foundation of this image and provide stability to our societies and economies. Climate action is one of the SDGs and is one of the identified planetary boundaries, which if exceeded will jeopardize the foundations in which our societies and economies operate. To avoid crossing this particular planetary boundary, science suggests that we must reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and should be aiming for net zero by 2050. These are facts of life that are unlikely to change. Changes in societal, ecological systems often produce a cascade of unanticipated consequences, giving rise to legal and contractual needs. All sectors of our economies begin to understand the full possible legal implications of climate change risks, including the emerging physical and transition risks that Dalit mentioned earlier in the presentation. And as they do so, our standard precedent terms will need to be revisited and reconsidered to take account of these emerging times. Let's hope that this short presentation will have enhanced the climate-conscious approach to the work done in the banking sector and contributed towards raising awareness of the contractual resources that are out there that can be modified for domestic consideration and used to anticipate and reduce climate-related risk. Thank you.
Jess, sorry, we can't hear you.
Yeah,
I can't hear you, Jess.
Yes, we can't hear you. I think there seems to be an issue. I had it earlier. Nobody could hear me with my mic. So
can everybody hear me now? Is it
now
better?
we can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ironically, I was just talking about the technical difficulties that we'd had at the beginning of the presentation, and I was just thanking the participants for bearing with us. And then, of course, as I did so, I was hit by technical difficulties myself. I was also saying that if there are any questions, please do put them in the Q&A block. We obviously haven't seen any, and I was hoping that that wasn't because of technical difficulties that everybody else is having. So then, just if there aren't any questions from the participants, perhaps one question that I can put to Colin in the last 5 minutes, which perhaps someone else was thinking about and didn't want and hasn't raised. Colin, when you were talking about carbon budgets and the setting of carbon budgets and how that will be done, you mentioned that the socioeconomic impact of setting those carbon budgets will be taken into account. Do you think that that means that there will be some kind of exemption or carve out or threshold level for SMEs and new entrants to a particular sector?
Thanks, Jess. I definitely think that would be a valid consideration, especially as we've seen with the impact over the last 2 years with our SMEs due to COVID impacts. And so it would be logical to at least exempt certain, whether it's on a sector basis or just on a broader SME basis. I think that would be a logical exemption to include.
So what will be interesting, I guess, will be to really grapple with who is afforded a carbon budget and who needs to engage with the carbon budget. But even for those without a carbon budget, picking up on what James was sharing around the race to net zero, it is essentially all corporate citizens' responsibility to ensure that their emissions are reduced and that a net zero position is reached.
Yes, definitely.
In the absence then of any further questions, I don't know, James and Darlet, if you had any other points you wanted to raise. But if not, I see you both shaking your heads. If not, I'm going to wrap up our session then. Thank again all the participants for joining us. I think you would have seen on the screen just before the lineup of what we have to come in the different webinars presented by different colleagues in different parts of the firm. So please do email our marketing team if you wish to join any of those webinars. And then finally, just a reminder that all of these webinars have been accredited for CPD, Continuous Professional Development Hours. And so to the extent that you are able to join a webinar and that you are not precluded by technical difficulties from being present on the webinar for the full hour, then you will be eligible for a CPD certificate, which our team will be able to issue to you. So just to bear that in mind as well. Thank you everybody for joining us today and for bearing with us, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you.